This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for June 4th, 2019, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Cuboids?
Christina Roach.
Hey everyone.
And producer Pat.
Hi, Checkers.
We have a great show for you today. I'm going to talk to you about whether the unmarried are happier. And then Adam is going to talk about the Doppler Effect and Fortnite. But first, did NBA player Manute Bol coin, "My bad"? Hashtag Go Raps. Christina?
So no big deal, guys, but my beloved NBA team, Toronto Raptors, won the Eastern Conference and made sports history a second time by hosting the first finals game ever in Canada. Wow. So in their honor, I thought it would be fun to do something basketball related. It's a way to also sneak it into the show.
You're like, I was doing this anyway, and I just had a segment.
So this little story is about an incredible former NBA player named Manute Bol and a longtime myth. Now, minus Pat, a.k.a. Coach Roach, have you guys ever heard of him?
Yes.
Yes, but if you ask me for almost any more information, I would have to say I don't have any.
Now, I know he's before your time, but if I said he was once the tallest guy in the NBA at 7'7", would that ring a bell at all?
Oh, yes, that guy. The tall one.
Well, you may have seen this famous photo from 1987 of Bol with his Bullets teammate and shortest player to play in the NBA, Muggsy Bogues, who is 5'3", which I'll bet we will use as the main photo for the show.
Surely. Yeah.
So like Kevin Hart and Shaq, basically.
It is something when you see that photo. Now, a little background on Manute Bol. He was born in Sudan and played for the likes of Golden State Warriors. You guys don't get it, but that's who we're playing in the finals right now.
Yeah.
Philadelphia 76ers, that was from 90 to 93. Golden State was from 88 to 90. And Miami Heat, 93. Now, he is considered among the best shot blockers in basketball history. He's actually the only NBA player to have more blocked shots than scored points, and not a shabby three-point shooter either, which is not common for someone his size. He was one of the two tallest players in the history of the NBA and retired from professional basketball in '95. He was also a political activist and used his celebrity, for lack of a better word, to promote human rights in Sudan, and he reportedly used the bulk of his salary to raise money for youth and refugees. But we're not going to talk about any of that really important stuff. You're here for the myth busting. So, did Manute Bol invent the colloquial term, "my bad"? When he passed away, many of the tributes made mention of him coining the phrase "my bad," which became a cool way of saying "my mistake" or "mea culpa" in pickup games. Now, we can trace this back to a 2005 UPenn language blog belonging to a British-American professor of linguistics named Geoffrey Pullum, who claimed Bol originated the term. Quote, "A friend emailed me to say that he heard the phrase was first used by the Sudanese immigrant basketball player Manute Bol, believed to have been a native speaker of Dinka, a language of the Nilo-Saharan superfamily. Says his friend Arneson, I first heard the phrase here in the Bay Area when Bol joined the Golden State Warriors in 1988, when several Warriors players started using the phrase." End quote. Wow. Indeed, there were many newspaper stories suggesting that Bol influenced his teammates to pick up on his quirky phrases, which they attribute to him being a native speaker of Dinka. St. Louis Post-Dispatch headline, 1989, when he throws a bad pass, he'll say, "my bad" instead of "my fault," and now all the other players say the same thing. USA Today headline, 1989, after making a bad pass, instead of saying "my fault," Manute Bol says "my bad." Now all the other Warriors say it too. Now Pullum goes on to say, quote, "So all of this is compatible with a date of origin for the phrase in the early 1980s. So Professor Ron McClamrock of the philosophy department at SUNY Albany tells me he recalls very definitely hearing the phrase on the basketball court when he was in graduate school at MIT in the early 1980s. So the news stories above could be picking the story up rather late. But it is still possible that Manute Bol was the originator because he played for Cleveland State and Bridgeport University in the early 80s and is Neologism could have spread from there to other schools in the Northeast, such as MIT. The debunker website featured Jeopardy all-star Ken Jennings debunking basketball myths recently, which was pretty fun. And one such myth was, did Manute Bol coin the phrase, my bad? He says linguists are skeptical because there are citations of the term back to the mid-'80s used by college players Rex Chapman and Dwayne Shinsis. So these guys were pretty much known for using this term. The first Google citation in 1985 was when Bol was just starting in the NBA. Okay, so let's use some logic here. Could he have coined the phrase when he started college ball in 1984? Sure, but it seems pretty unlikely that within a year, a fresh-faced kid starting NBA ball could influence the vernacular to the point that it gets a Google citation 1 year later, right? Mm-hmm. His height and all of that aside. Now, it certainly sounds like he helped popularize the term, but there really is no evidence to suggest the phrase was born out of his Dinka dialect or that he actually coined the phrase, my bad.
I didn't realize this was a basketball phrase. This is a phrase that around 2000 started being popular amongst everybody. I wonder if it's possible that he independently originated the term. I guess the fact that it was already around in basketball would make that sort of suspect. Or is it also possible that other references are misremembered? But I guess if it's a Google citation, that's pretty solid. It's not like, I think I remember hearing it in the 80s, and then that could be wrong, right?
Yeah. In 85, it became a Google official thing.
It is an interesting point that Adam's, I guess, trying to make is like, if there's a sort of multiple discovery type thing going on, and then it would be like, what are the key nodes of influence that cause it to catch on, whether it's a famous athlete or a famous musician, or as we know, like hip hop culture became more popular, and then people started adopting that, meaning white people start adopting that, and then because there's more white people in the United States, then it becomes more pervasive as a phrase.
Yeah.
Cristina and I were talking about this just recently. The term Yaz has become popular quite recently for people to see Yaz or Yaz Queen. And a lot of people trace it back to recent television shows. But I listened to a podcast that traces it all the way back to the 70s and gay culture. And
drag culture specifically.
Drag culture specifically, yeah.
Which was, it was very fascinating to hear who actually coined this term. But in this case, this is all, Adam makes a good point, but it really is all anecdotal. So Professor Joe Blow heard people use this definitely in the such and such 80s, I guess we can't, the point is we can't say definitively, so.
Mm-hmm. It's just the fact that him having a poor grasp on English makes me wonder if him being one of the people who used it a lot early may not have been because he heard it from someone else, but just because he was saying it wrong.
He had a few quirky phrases from what I read, but that one obviously caught on because the Warriors his teammates started saying it all the time, and then it,
It makes a nice story, and people really do like stories, even though stories often turn out to be less accurate than something else.
Right. Yeah. Well, there are other Manute Bol myths that we could debunk. I've always heard that when he was drafted into the NBA, he was so tall, he saw other people dunking, and he jumped up to dunk and knocked his teeth out.
Do you know if that's true?
Well, I know that it's not true because he played for the Sudanese national team. He played in high school, he was already a basketball player, but yeah. Maybe we get into that some other time.
Thanks, Cristina. And now on to whether unmarried people are happier. You wonderful listeners of the show have often heard us speak about scientific information being poorly reported in media, or the fact that most people don't read beyond a headline before they share information that aligns with beliefs they already have. But if you read an article from a reputable news organization about research from an expert from a well-regarded institution, does that mean what you've shared is true? No, it doesn't. As this just happened to me. I wanted to share this story as a cautionary tale. Okay, here's the events. I shared an article from the UK newspaper The Guardian by Sean Kane. The article itself was written on Saturday, May 25th, 2019. No trickery like I did with that presidential war thing. With the title, Women Are Happier Without Children or a Spouse, says happiness expert. And the subtitle, Behavioral Scientist Paul Dolan says traditional markers of success no longer apply. The article says that women who do not marry or have kids live longer and are happier. It is about the work of Paul Dolan from the London School of Economics. It quotes him as saying, quote, "We do have some good longitudinal data following the same people over time, but I'm going to do a massive disservice to that science and just say, if you're a man, you should probably get married. If you're a woman, don't bother." Further, Dolan says men calm down during marriage, and another quote from the article, "You take less risks, you earn more money at work, and you live a little longer. She, on the other hand, has to put up with that and dies sooner than if she never married. The healthiest and happiest population subgroup are women who have never married or had children." I found his forthright manner endearing, but here was the obvious excerpt that I shared on Facebook. Quote, "Married people are happier than other population subgroups, but only when their spouse is in the room when they are asked how happy they are." "When the spouse is not present, f***ing miserable," he said.
Wow.
I introduced this nuance statement on Facebook with some helpful context. Shots fired. Such bait is too good to pass up, which is probably why it got covered in the first place.
So did you have any Facebook friends whose spouses weren't on Facebook who gave maybe a different
That's
impression?
funny. Are you replying to that comment and me watching you do it at the same time? So I shared this on May 28th, and within a day or two, my skeptical friend Mike Lawrence shared a link to a Twitter thread by Gary Kimbrough that was critical of the article. Saving the suspense, Dolan misunderstood the meaning of certain categories in the survey data he was citing, and on top of that, his graph comparing the happiness of different groups doesn't seem to show much difference between those groups. I'll unpack each of those. In the Guardian piece, it said, quote, "Dolan's latest book, Happy Ever After, cites evidence from the American Time Use Survey, ATUS, which compared levels of pleasure and misery in unmarried, married, divorced, separated, and widowed individuals."
Misery. What a word.
It's a word. But the Guardian piece also used to say this ATUS data compared whether a spouse was present or absent and how that affected the results, which is where that delicious quotation comes from. The issue is that Dolan misunderstood what the categories married, spouse present, and married, spouse absent meant. As Kimbrough points out on Twitter, and this will be linked to in our show notes at trcpodcast.com.
That's a great website.
Quote, "The marital status information isn't even collected as part of the ATUS phone interview. A narrower question about the presence of a spouse or unmarried partner in the household is asked at the ATUS interview." Could this be correct? Well, given that The Guardian changed the article they wrote, I think it's highly likely that it's valid criticism. At the bottom of the Guardian piece, it now reads, "This article was amended on the 30th of May 2019 to remove remarks by Paul Dolan that contain a misunderstanding of an aspect of the American Time Use Survey data." Okay, so expert misunderstands survey data and gets headlines is not great, but it is worse. Now, figure 8 in Dolan's book, which was shared in Gary Kimbrough's Twitter feed thread, that compares happiness among groups of never married, married in the absent present conditions, divorced, widowed, and separated, looks like there are meaningful differences. This is a bar graph for those trying to picture it. But Research Methods 101, let's look at that y-axis. You're going to have to imagine along with me. The y-axis is the variable average pleasure out of 6. So a basic, legit graph would have the y-axis that goes from 0 to 6.
There's not many values. It's not like you have to truncate that
No.
guy.
This one has a y-axis that goes from 3.8 to 4.5, with all the responses falling in between 4.25 and 4.5.
That's crap.
Poor form indeed.
Yeah.
Second, there are no error bars. If there are numerical differences between the categories, one does not know if this is statistically significant or not. Error bars or asterisks usually help the reader understand such things. Third, the largest difference between the two groups is 0.25 units on the y-axis or less. This is on a 6-point scale, which is around 4%, which doesn't sound like a lot. Now, one could argue that a 4% increase in happiness is significant because it is hard to increase happiness at all, but we can put that aside for the moment. The difference between the spouse present and absence groups looks like it's about 0.15 units, which is less than a 2% difference. What's more, Dolan assumed this was because people inflate their happiness rating because their spouse is present. Again, no evidence for that, for several reasons I just listed. But why not go with another explanation? People are actually happier when their spouse is present.
Yes, like their spouse being absent may be like, we don't see each other a lot because my spouse is out drinking, or
Right.
you know,
They're just not there.
Our
And it doesn't-
job
sure,
schedules don't line
They
up.
feel better when they're in the room. There's been other studies
Yeah.
that show that people might be able to have their hand in cold water longer if their spouse is there offering emotional support.
Sure.
So in all the criticisms I've seen, I haven't seen that particular one just yet.
Yeah.
Now, I haven't even touched on whether happiness is the only thing that matters, or perhaps there is some other idea of meaning or something else in life that people consider important, let alone the differences in the ratings that were given about an experience that we have at the time are different than the one we might have when we're remembering it later. This is relates to Kahneman's work on the experiential self and the remembered self, and they aren't quite the same thing. Messy indeed, and a complicated state of affairs for anyone who is curious. So what are we going to do here? Well, as we know, through photographic manipulation, video editing, and less credible sources getting a lot of attention, it seems it's getting harder to know whether something is true or not. But it's not just that. Rightfully, our standards have increased. We don't want to just defer to authority. We know science isn't perfect, and we're all subject to different biases. So what do we do, though? Well, if one is going to share articles, it is probably best to highlight uncertainty around accuracy and reliability. Does this mean that most discussions will become even more messy and people will be less likely to believe what is true? Yes and no. Messy, probably. Believe what is true? Well, it is more important that people are aware that their beliefs weren't on a firm foundation in the first place. I do think that's important. Of course, the concern then is that people try to reasonably update their worldview, but it might go too far, and then they think the earth is flat and they come out against vaccines. So when you read an interesting story by someone from the London School of Economics in a nice newspaper, you have to go now default, well, I'll just see that as junk and not share it.
Yeah.
Or maybe you share it, say, I can't verify any of this. I don't know. Now, someone else, Kelsey Piper in Vox, pointed out that books have a much lower standard for reliability and rigor than published papers. And this isn't a book. It's not necessarily research that he collected first and then put in a book, which I kind of assumed he did. And so if it's just in a book, well, I mean, who cares? Like, you can put anything in a book as long as it's not going to defame someone, because the standards for accuracy and error checking are just not that high.
But a book may not be as thorough as a published paper, but an article will also not be very thorough. And it really depends.
An article on a website, yes. Oh, yes.
An article in a newspaper,
an article
or magazine, or website.
About a book.
Yeah.
Yes.
Maybe married people are happy, but there's nothing worse than being in an unhappy marriage. You know, as a person who's been married twice, you know, the difference between just being in a relationship and being married to me wasn't huge from a happiness level, but being in a bad marriage is definitely a very bad state to be in. Just something to throw in there.
I think this is a really good lesson in when you see something like this, no matter what the source is or if it's something that may fit in with your confirmation bias, that you go, okay, that's really interesting. So what are they citing as evidence, and what's the study? And it's really taught me, being on the show, to do that. And I'm such a better person for it, because there are articles that sound really awesome, and then you kind of get into, I mean, there was one about quantum physics lately, and I saw some of the comments saying, how is this different than anything else that we already knew about the quantum world? And so I don't know. I think this just kind of highlights that you really have to look at these kinds of headlines with a skeptical point of view.
And to your point, Cristina, about general headlines, there's also the context of the overall research. We often talk about a new study coming out, like, well, what is the context of the history of all the research? Because one new study can't undo all of that. Somewhat similarly, this guy's written a book, which apparently he's done a poor job analyzing data in various parts, which doesn't jive at all with tons of other data, which show that married people are happier and live longer, healthier lives. If people are curious about that, you can check out some work by Nicholas Wolfinger, who's sort of studied this stuff. But in general, this book is apparently not to be trusted, although it sounds like it might be interesting, and it's certainly provocative, and it's definitely getting a lot of headlines. Because it's nice bait, it doesn't mean it's to be trusted. Also, that graph that I mentioned, which showed there's almost no differences, the least happy group, never married.
Right.
So you're like, really? So the comparison between the married present, married absent spouse wasn't that great, and the never married was least happy. Again, without error bars, you can't actually make sense of any of it. And now we turn to Adam for the Doppler effect and Fortnite.
Because I have an 11 and 13-year-old at home, that means Fortnite day and night.
Oh, yeah, an 11 and 13-year-old and yourself, Adam. You forgot about yourself.
I don't actually play, but yes,
okay.
I have too many parental responsibilities for that.
We both know that's not true.
I played Pokemon. This wildly addictive battle royale game is a mishmash of pretty much everything out there, and one beef I have with the game, which I hear at the start of every single match, is the sound effect when a player leaves the battle bus. I'll get into why it annoys me, but first I want to discuss the Doppler Effect. Though we haven't talked about the Doppler Effect on the podcast, some astronaut listeners may have noticed that it's been covered on 5 Minutes with an Astronomer. For those who aren't familiar with it, 5 Minutes with an Astronomer is a short crossover between the Reality Check and the Exposing Pseudo-Astronomy podcast, in which Pat and Cristina ask friend of the show, astronomer Stuart Robbins, a question about astronomy, and then he answers it in less than 5 minutes. In a Season 1 episode, the topic is the Doppler Effect, and Stuart gives a good explanation focusing on the astronomy implications of the Doppler Effect, so I would suggest checking it out, and of course, checking out other episodes of that show. So, what is the Doppler Effect? It's basically a change in frequency when the source and the observer are moving relative to each other. The classic example is that of a horn or a siren on a fast-moving vehicle, which when the vehicle is approaching you has a slightly higher pitch, and then when it's getting further away from you, it has a slightly lower pitch. So why is this? Well, sound, like many other things, has a frequency. Sound waves that we can hear generally have a frequency between about 20 hertz and 2000 hertz. Depends on the ears, depends on the person, but that's a rough idea. So on the low end, there are about 20 vibrations a second. On the high end, about 2000. So if an object producing this sound, like say an ambulance with a siren, is traveling towards you, then those vibrations occur slightly closer together, because the time between one vibration and the next is reduced by the distance the object has traveled during that brief time. This doesn't seem like much time to move very far, but for a very fast-moving object like vehicles going 50 to 100 kilometers an hour, or whatever that miles equivalent is, this can cause quite a difference, quite an audible difference. Similarly, while the object is moving away from the observers, the vibrations are slightly further apart as the object has moved away slightly between each vibration, so that pitch is slightly lower, makes for a different sound. So the end result in a car or a bus honking a horn while passing you on the street is something which sounds something like this. So it starts out higher pitch, then goes a bit lower. So that's the sound from the Wikipedia page. It's physics in action. Amazing. So Fortnite has this battle bus. Basically, when the players are dropped onto the Hunger Games style battlefield, they are flown over it in a flying bus. This is basically a bus with a small hot air balloon over it. I say small because even if the bus was a basket, the balloon would be far too small to keep it afloat. But that's not the physics problem that I'm here to complain about. That's just not the physics problem.
Tune in next week for my other complaints about Fortnite.
Yeah, the gravity makes no sense. People jump too high. All sorts of problems. As the player is dropped from the battle bus, falling straight down as the battle bus travels away, we hear the following sound.
The Fortnite one sounds pretty similar to the Wikipedia one you played.
That's right, Darren. So speeding car horn on Wikipedia sounds almost identical to the sound in here. The problem is the battle bus is not passing the player. The player and the camera point of view, which is immediately behind the player in a third-person view, are traveling away from the bus at a somewhat constant speed. Now, if we wanted to really hash out what the Doppler effect on the horn of the battle bus would be, then we could calculate the speed of the battle bus traveling vertically and compare it to the effect of gravity on the player minus whatever drag is happening in this game. Now, this probably wouldn't be that hard to drum up in something like MATLAB or something like that, but it's been about 20 years since I've used the program, so forgive me for not relearning it just for this segment. So much to say, gravity, air resistance, and terminal velocity also don't seem to be ultra-realistic in the I can jump higher than Super Mario while no-scoping my opponent's world of Fortnite, so the Doppler effect should be somewhat consistent and should only reduce the frequency and not have the characteristics of an increased frequency followed by a quick transition and then a lower frequency as we get in the game. So in the real world, the bus comes towards you, you hear and then when it's going away from you, you hear. So in Fortnite, having both those sounds makes no sense.
So Adam, do you use this as a learning experience with your children?
Yes. The children and my wife are very tired of me pointing out that an inaccuracy in the game.
So you're reducing that happiness chart in that marriage graph, eh?
So, more on the Doppler effect? Sure. One might wonder why, in day-to-day use, we don't notice the Doppler effect in things like other people's voices. Well, it's likely mostly due to the fact that lower speeds are involved when people are walking towards each other and speaking. But the fact that we don't have a constant tone is likely also a factor. If I'm screaming at someone from a moving car, my voice will be slightly up-pitched as I approach and then down-pitched as I leave. But unless I'm singing on a very steady note, the person may not really notice that difference. That said, while it's easiest to notice the effect with a tone like a siren or a horn, you can also hear it with just the noise of a vehicle's motor. So if you're standing on the side of a street and a car comes towards you, if you listen, you will hear it making like a shh. It will make a slight difference there. The Doppler effect is not limited to sound, but anything which has a wave or frequency, such as anything involving light. This isn't likely to affect most things we see in our day-to-day life, as the speeds at which we travel aren't that fast. Theoretically, a car would have its color slightly shifted as it approaches and distances itself, but this isn't something we could notice with the naked eye. As Stuart mentions in 5 Minutes with an Astronomer, the Doppler effect is used a lot in astronomy with light. This uses what is called red shifting and blue shifting. These aren't the red and blue lights on a police car. They're not moving that fast. This is due to red and blue being at either ends of the visible spectrum of light for humans. That's why we use these terms. That said, a lot of so-called red and blue shifting, which is used in astronomy, may not necessarily be measuring visible light or something that is actually looking red or blue. As an object moves towards the observer, or more accurately, as the object and the observer move towards each other, the light is blue shifted. The frequency is increased slightly, causing for visible light the colors to shift a bit more blue. Likewise, for objects moving away from each other, they redshift or have a slightly lower frequency. So what can we do with this? If we have a baseline for certain wavelengths of light, and then we expect an object to have that wavelength, for example, the wavelengths at which hydrogen glows in a star are a good example, then we can measure the difference between that baseline and what is observed to calculate the speed of an object, or the speed difference between us and that object. Edwin Hubble used this to determine that all objects which were furthest away from us in all directions were redshifted, and so that they were moving away from us, which suggested that the universe itself was expanding. Now, there are other practical uses of Doppler, such as radar guns for measuring the speed of your car. A radar is transmitted from the radar gun, and then as it bounces off the car, it is returned at a slightly higher frequency if moving towards the gun, or a lower frequency if the car is moving away from the gun, based on your car's speed. And then it's captured by the radar receiver, does a little bit of math, tells you how fast you're going, maybe gives you a ticket. Doppler can also be used for weather. Growing up, I remember hearing about the Rochester Doppler radar on the news, as Rochester is one of the closer U.S. cities to Ottawa, so we get a lot of their network affiliates here. This uses a type of pulse radar, which I think would be a bit much to get into this short segment, but the physics involved are fairly interesting. The Doppler effect is an interesting phenomenon which can be noticed anytime you're passed by a car. This intuitive example is easy to find in the real world, but sadly, not accurately reflected in the world of Fortnite. For all the things that game ripped off, I guess they couldn't be bothered to rip off real life's physics for their battle bus.
Oh, snap. And maybe if they'd done that, they would be popular.
Obviously not necessary to make millions of money by selling V-Bucks.
Maybe you should rate their marketing department.
You know, if they got that Doppler right, they could line their pockets. Well, thank you, Adam, for your insightful segment masquerading your rant. And thank you, listeners, for joining us once again. Cristina explored whether Manute Bol was the originator of the phrase, "my bad," and it seems like there's no evidence to indicate he was, although he may have helped popularize it. I explored whether unmarried people are happier, and it is definitely not the case based on research that this Dolan figure is trying to promote, but it may be true in other things if we get some more data, but it doesn't seem to be the case. And finally, the Doppler effect was delightful. Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, Cuboids.
Go Raptors!
We'll talk to you next week, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.
Oh, thanks.
Professor Ron McClamrock. It's quite the name.
Stop making up names.
It sounds like
Ron.
Exactly. Irish McIrish and McClamrock.
it totally sounds like Fred Flintstone's boss on the Flintstones, who's Irish.
You wonderful listeners of the show will know that my phone just went off. Sorry, Pat.
The listeners know that.
When Cristina said, "Oh, that's fine. Cut that." Sorry, I mean keep that, and then new paragraph.
Yes, mein Führer.
Oh, wow.
I finally get the respect I deserve. Whew.